absolutely no idea what it would be like to be away from my family, serving my country. Nor do I know what it would be like having a loved one being away, serving our country. And I know that many of you have done that and you've lived that, and I know that our saying thank you from the pulpit is not going to take the concerns and the sacrifice that your family's made away, but I do feel that we need to acknowledge that and let you know how much we appreciate that on Memorial Day. So, thank you. I feel like, because I use so many references from the classroom, that if you're a visitor today and you don't know me, you need to know I'm a teacher. So that's where I spend my entire life, except for when I'm going to the gym, coming home and eating and going to sleep, as Marshall will attest to. Most of my life is spent with kids between 4th grade and 6th grade, and I thoroughly enjoy it. And one of the things I really like about them is their honesty and their frankness, and how you can talk to them and you know exactly what they're feeling and what they're thinking. And you know, sometimes they say and do things that they shouldn't do, but they're children. And as long as you remember that they're children and they are not adults, and our job is to help them make them into responsible adults, then you develop thick skin and you can put up with the things that they say if they tend to be hurtful. But I just wanted you to know that because several of my references today are from teaching. Our text today is Matthew 12, 1 through 8, as you can see in your bulletin, so if you want to follow from there, that would be great. But before we do that, I would like to talk to you about something that we do discuss in class. It's the difference between a person's attributes and their character traits. And I think this will make sense later on in the sermon. But when we're discussing literature in my class and we're talking about character traits versus attributes, the main difference is that attributes can include physical characteristics, whether they're tall, short, or they have hair on their head or more hair on their chin than on their head. Those can be attributes of the person. But character descriptions or character traits are limited to what the people do and what they say. And of course, if you're reading a book where you can actually hear what the person's thinking, then that also is an avenue to which you can look at a character and make an analysis of their character. In relationships with one another, however, we don't get that third avenue. We can't read each other's minds, even though Mrs. Oler told me I needed to trim a couple of eyelashes because they look like antennae, and she was sure that I could stand here and transmit my sermon to you without speaking. So I removed those, so now I'm required to speak. I told her I was going to get her this morning. But the difference between attributes and character traits, in my opinion, is what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking about when he said that he had a dream that his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, a physical attribute, but by the content of their character, what they say and do. And he was pointing out a biblical principle that's in James, when James tells us that we're not to be face judgers, which is what the word prejudiced means. But when discussing this with my students, again, being 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, having a teacher who likes to tease and joke, I have to set boundaries at the beginning of the year and remind them of the boundaries. And some of the things that I remind them of is you may not ever tease or joke about someone's race or their family or their clothes, because none of us get to choose who our families are. None of us get to choose what race we are. And 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, they don't get to choose their clothing. They wear what their parents provide for them. So for those things, in my classroom, the kids never get to joke about those. And I try to encourage them not to be hurtful when they're talking about what someone says or what someone does. But, you know, oftentimes the best thing to do when someone does something silly is to laugh. And sometimes we just have to do that, especially when we're the ones doing the silly thing. We just have to laugh at ourselves. And that's okay, because again, that's something that we say or do. So I brought all that up because I want you to do this for me. I want you to go through a little mental exercise. I want you to think about somebody that you know very, very well. And I want you to make a list of 5 character traits that they have, not 5 physical descriptions. So I'm going to give you a little time to do that, and try to be as specific as you can. Don't say something general like, well, this person that I'm thinking of is a loving person, because that could mean a lot of different things to different people and could change depending upon the circumstance. So take a little time and think about 5 character traits of somebody that you know very, very well. Now I want you to pick 2 of those character traits that you would want people to think about you. What is it, which 2 of those character traits that when someone thinks of you, would you want them to say, that person is blank? So apply those to yourself. And I did this because I know that a lot of times if I asked you to think of a character trait about yourself, we would all start thinking about our negative character traits. And I didn't want you thinking about that, but you're much more likely to point out the positive things in someone that you love. So that's why I did it that way. So keep those 2 positive, hopefully positive character traits that you have in your head about that person. And then we're going to look at our text. Our text is about the Sabbath. So I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then we'll go back and examine it. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was unlawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or have you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? I tell you that one greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So I thought before we talked, we needed to go over some of the Sabbath laws and how important the Sabbath was. And by the way, from my recollection, there's really only 2 things that define you as a Jew. One was circumcision, if you were a male, on the 8th day, which was allowed to be done on the Sabbath in order to keep the 8th day. And the other was the keeping of the Sabbath. And if you go through and read the punishment for not keeping the Sabbath, it was death. So that's how important the Jews saw this law that was being broken by Jesus' disciples. Some of the things that were prohibited, mentioned by name, harvesting grain. You could not work even during the plowing season, and you could not harvest grain on the Sabbath, even during the harvest. You had to rest. That was what God said. God said this is going to be a covenant between us, that people are going to know that you are my people because you are going to rest on the Sabbath day. So that's the background. That's the religious background to our text. The punishment was death for desecrating the Sabbath. Or in another section it said that you will be cut off from my people, which if that doesn't mean death, that means an outcast from the kingdom. It was to be a sign between God and the Israelites. So picking grain was definitely not allowed on the Sabbath. Going for a long walk according to the Pharisees, was not allowed on the Sabbath. So we have Jesus walking through or past a grain field, and his disciples are picking grain. So already, how far did he walk? The Pharisees might have a problem with that. I think it's interesting the Pharisees were also at the grain fields. What were they doing there? I think they were there to catch Jesus walking past the grain fields. So they may have broken their own Sabbath rules so they could catch Jesus breaking Sabbath rules. But we don't know that. That's only speculation. They may have been on their way to the synagogue, and they may have left their mat halfway there so that would be their home, so they could walk to their home, and then they could walk from their home to their synagogue, and then they could walk back to home. Because if you left your sleeping mat halfway there, that was your home. So they had ways to get around things. So maybe they covered themselves. I don't know. But anyways, they were also at the grain fields. The disciples picked grain, which was harvesting. And Luke tells us they rubbed it together to separate the edible part from the unedible part. And then they were eating it. So they definitely were guilty of doing work on the Sabbath. The Pharisees, of course, were waiting for a response from Jesus because they thought, caught you red-handed. Your disciples are doing something that deserves death. What are you going to do about it? And of course, they expected him to condemn the behavior, but Jesus went along. Now, for those of you that think about, well, they were also stealing when they were picking somebody else's grain, there is a provision in the law that that was okay to do. If you were walking through someone's field and you were hungry, and it wasn't the Sabbath day, it was okay for you to pick grain and eat it. You could even go into a vineyard and pick grapes and eat them. If you were traveling, it was kind of like a Denny's. That was the way that God provided for travelers. If you were hungry, you could pick enough to eat right then and eat it. You just couldn't put it in your bag and take it with you. So you couldn't be a backpacker and take your food with you, but you could eat what you came across. So what they were doing was a normal, acceptable thing, except for that it was the Sabbath day. Other things that were not allowed, lighting fires, cooking food. So in a few minutes we're going to hear about the priests in the temple. But if you were a woman and you were in charge of the meals on the Sabbath day, you couldn't cook. So the way that they got around that is Sabbath started Friday night when the sun went down. And it was over Saturday night when the sun went down. So if you were smart, you would cook your meal Friday before the sun went down. So you'd have a nice dinner Friday night. And then you would wait until Saturday night to light your fire after the sun went down and cook your next meal. So you could actually, for us, the way we think about food, you could have your dinners and they could be cooked. It was your breakfast and your lunch that you would have to worry about if you ate those two meals that couldn't be cooked. And of course you can't cook if you don't tend to or light the fire because it's going to go out. So they had their system of doing things in order to obey the Sabbath law. So what we've established so far, the disciples of Jesus were guilty of breaking the Sabbath law. What punishment could they have received? They could have received death. They could have been cut off from their people. But then Jesus brings up, after the disciples have condemned them, in verse 3, Jesus answers, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry?" Now, of course, the disciples were eating because they were hungry. The Pharisees are going to make an exception because it was David and he was being chased by Saul. And Saul was trying to kill him. And this was King David, soon king to be David, that broke this rule. So we can forgive that. And Jesus is saying, these are my disciples. And later he's going to say, the Son of Man. So he is placing himself above the role of King David. But Jesus says, look, you guys know what King David did. He ate the bread that was consecrated only for the priests. After it was displayed, the priests could eat it, and David ate it because he was hungry. And yet the Pharisees would not have called for David's death. That was not something they would have done. And then he goes on and says, well, what about the part of the Sabbath where the priests desecrate the temple? They light fires. They offer sacrifices in the temple on the Sabbath day. That's part of the worship of the Sabbath day in the temple. So the priests also were desecrating the Sabbath during worship, and they were actually told to do it in the law. And Jesus says to them, there's someone greater than the temple here. Because the Pharisees, according to some, had this principle that they lived by, that if two things contradicted each other, you went with the most important. So the Sabbath worship was more important than the Sabbath laws. So because the Sabbath worship was more important than the Sabbath laws, it was okay if the priests sacrificed and lit fires on the Sabbath, and they wouldn't be guilty. So Jesus says, or haven't you read in the law, that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent. So again, we have somebody committing a crime and yet they're innocent of the crime. And then Jesus tells them this. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. I'm going to turn my page before I get lost. Last week I left some things off. So last week we learned that God has a treasure of kindness, tolerance, and patience, and that he freely gives his righteousness to us because of our faith in Jesus. From this week's lesson, we see that Jesus shares the same character trait as his Father. He calls the guilty innocent. When God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, he's telling us his heart desire. If you were asked to give a character trait of God, you should start with the character traits that God reveals about himself in his spoken word. And one of those character traits that he just mentioned is that his heart desire is mercy. So when God says his character trait is mercy, we need to listen to that. And just as God left the sins unpunished in the past, he, through his Son, reminds us that he is a God who calls the guilty innocent. So we might find ourselves asking, why did God ask for the sacrifices then? If he wants mercy instead of sacrifices, why did he ask for the sacrifices in the first place? But why did he give us laws to continue to follow if what he really was going to do was forgive us when we broke the laws, when we find ourselves guilty, if he desired the mercy rather than the following of the laws? And for me, my point is, by following God's teachings, it makes our lives better. We are blessed when we follow God's teachings. It's not that we are going to be punished when we don't. God is willing to forgive us when we don't. But if you follow God's teachings, your life's going to be better. I don't think anyone at any time in history would argue that it's better to be unfaithful to your wife than it is to be faithful to your wife. I don't think anyone is going to argue that your life is going to be blessed if you're unfaithful in your marriage. So if you follow that commandment of God, you're going to reap the benefits of that. You're going to have a better relationship. You're going to have better finances. You're not going to have to go through the heartache that comes with that sin. I don't think anyone's going to say that spending all the Sabbath day with your family is a bad thing. It's going to tear your family apart if you spend a whole day together from the time your children are babies until they're ready to leave home. There's no one that's going to say that, and yet that's what the Sabbath was for, was to have family time. I don't think anyone's going to argue that it would be better if you had something and I wanted it if I could just take it from you. Stealing's okay. I don't think anyone's going to argue that those things make our lives better if we don't follow God's teachings. So I don't want you to think that God is saying don't follow the laws. There was a purpose. He gave us the laws and the rules, and that was to make our lives better. This is not about making our lives better through following the laws. These scriptures, and today's lesson, is about what God does when we don't follow the laws. So, again, I want you to understand that when we follow God's laws, our lives will be better. The laws are not written, or the laws are written for us to follow, but they don't apply to God. He exists above the laws. And it's funny, I skipped the same part last week and got confused at the end of my sermon because I was thinking in my head, you forgot a part. I skipped it again. Maybe I shouldn't say it. I don't know. This is 2 times. I'm going to back up a little. When God said that He was wanting great mercy and not sacrifice, it makes me remember conversations I've had with students. And one boy particularly this year, he is a very talkative young man, very personable. You would love to spend recess time talking with him. He's that kind of kid. However, he has some habits that aren't right. He likes to talk when you're talking. He likes to ask questions that he knows don't have anything to do with the lesson because he wants to get out doing work. He doesn't particularly like math, so any topic other than math is a good thing to talk about in math class. And so he comes to tutoring in the morning because he wants to, which again is probably more of a social time for him. But he, the other day, like most kids that get in trouble a lot, pointed out when another kid who hardly ever gets in trouble did something wrong, and I told him to stop, and the situation was taken care of. He made the comment, that's not fair. If I had done that, I would have gotten in trouble. So I asked him, well, by fair do you mean it's not just? He said, yes. I said, well, then, so we're talking about justice then. He said, yes, I want to talk about justice, because I told you he likes to ask questions, so I used it against him. He asked me about justice, and I told him, well, do you know that most people in our country think that justice is only one-sided? They think that justice means the innocent go free. And he looked at me and I said, but do you also know that justice means the guilty have to be punished? And so you're asking me to treat you with justice? And he looked at me and I said, that means every time you do something wrong, I have to punish you. And he said, no, that fast. Because he knew that he did not want me treating him with justice. He was used to me showing him mercy, and he wanted that to continue. So once he realized that justice has 2 sides to it, he decided he didn't want to have justice. And I explained to him that personally, if I'm ever on trial, I want people chanting mercy, 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 not justice, 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 because if I'm on trial, I probably did something wrong. And I know that's a bad assumption, but that's my personal experience, and I know that there are innocent people that get accused, and then we do want justice. If the person is innocent, we certainly want justice. But in my case, when I get a speeding ticket, I'm not going to stand in front of the judge and say, justice, justice, justice. I want to say mercy, mercy, mercy. So having that conversation with him, that lets you know what God is saying when he says, I desire mercy. He wishes to show us mercy, not when we're innocent, but when we're guilty. And that's the character trait that God is explaining to the Pharisees, is that he is a God whose heart desire is to show mercy. And of course, since he wants us to be like him, then he wants us also to be someone whose heart desire is to show mercy. Okay. Now I can go on from that paragraph. When I said that God exists above the law, that the law was written for man and for us to follow to make our lives better. It was not written for God to follow. The easiest way for me to explain the difference is another example from school. I've got too many things in my pocket. My pocket knife. I have carried a pocket knife like this since I was 14. Even at school, when I was in high school, no one ever said you can't bring a pocket knife. Now, kids can be suspended or expelled for bringing a pocket knife. So, every time when I have a staple to remove, I pull my blade out and I take the staple out, or I take the scissors, or I need to pull someone's splinter out, which I can't legally do, so I say, splinter, nice, sorry, can't help you. But if you were to pick these tweezers up off my desk, and I didn't see you pick them up, and you got your splinter out by yourself, then you put my tweezers back on my desk. That's not me giving you tweezers. See, I was being a Pharisee, by the way, finding loopholes in the law. Then that would be okay with me. You certainly wouldn't have to worry about taking the tweezers off my desk. But every time I pull this out in class, I hear, "Ooh, Mr. Oler has a pocket knife." And then we have to have the discussion that I'm not a student, and those rules and laws apply to students, not adults, and I'm an adult, and just like I can drive a car and you can't, just like I can vote and you can't, I can carry a pocket knife and you can't. And that's what I think we need to be careful of when we are looking at our God and our Creator, who created us, who knows what rules will help us have a blessed life. When he gives us rules to live by, it's going to make our life better if we follow them. But we can't turn around and say, well, because he gave us these rules to make our lives better, we can apply these same rules to God, and God also has to follow these same rules that he's given to us. And that, I think, is what we need to be careful about. And that is one of the rules that the Pharisees made. The Pharisees didn't know who they were talking to. They were talking to God on earth. And when God on earth says it's okay for you to pick grain and eat it on the Sabbath, it's okay for you to pick grain and eat it on the Sabbath. And there's nobody else that's going to be able to condemn you for that. And when he says you're innocent for doing it, you're innocent of doing wrongdoing. And when he says it's okay for the priest to do it in the temple, it's okay for the priest to do it in the temple. And when he says it was okay for David to eat the consecrated bread, it's okay for David to eat the consecrated bread. So, I look at it this way. If we want to be better than the Pharisees, we need to learn that God wants us to show mercy to others the same way that he shows it to us. So when a person's guilty of wronging us, are we willing to show mercy? That's the hard part. Understanding that God is showing us mercy is the easy part. Taking that principle, that character trait of God, and applying it into our own lives is the hard part. So if you're at work and someone is spreading lies about you, and you confront them, and they confess that they did it, are you going to show mercy? Or are you going to hold it against them? Are you going to demand sacrifice? Are you going to demand that they do something to make it up to you? Or are you going to show them mercy? That's the character trait that God would want you to show. At church, when people disagree with us, or say harmful things, or things that hurt our feelings, are we going to condemn them? Or are we going to show them mercy? with our kids or our spouses when they did something wrong and they know it and they've told us that they know it? Are we going to show them mercy, or are we going to condemn them? That's the difference. That's where it becomes difficult. And another area. I personally believe that it is our job to study God's Word, to carefully analyze what it is He wants us to do and how He wants us to live our life, to examine the things that He wants us to do in regards to salvation and what acts we need to follow. That is our job, to understand that and do our very best at it. And so, me personally, every believer should be baptized. There's no question about that. In the early church, they did it. It was a work, if you want to call it a work. I don't care. Everything that we do, you could call a work. Singing could be called a work if you want to say it's something you're doing. Baptism could be a work. Communion could be a work. I know we're not saved by works, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore commandments of God. So we need to follow the commandments of God to the best of our ability. That having been said, I think we also need to be careful that we don't condemn others who have a different opinion than us. It's okay to say, you have your opinion, we have ours. Let's get together and try to find a mutual understanding to bring us together in understanding. But I don't think it's okay for us to say, we know that because you aren't following the commands that we understand, that God is going to condemn you. Because what we know from this text is that our God desires mercy. And if He wants to forgive somebody who has a different opinion than us, that is okay with me. Because when I'm in the wrong, I am going to want that same God to show me mercy. And that, I think, is the way that we can bridge our understanding with people. Yes, this is what we believe. We are not going to change what we believe. It is our job to follow what we believe with our whole hearts, to teach what we believe to the best of our abilities. But when it comes to the point where we have to say, are we going to show mercy and understanding, or are we going to condemn, that we fall on the side of mercy because we worship a God whose character trait is desiring mercy. Again, that does not mean that we don't follow God's teachings. That just means to be very careful when we condemn, because as we saw last week, we don't know God's entire plan. We don't know all the facts. All we can do is do our very best to follow what we believe in. So, I'm hoping that we as a church can grow in our understanding of what it's like to worship a merciful God. Because I know when I was growing up, my view of God was far from the merciful God. My view of God was a condemning God. I don't know why these scriptures weren't stressed, but my view of God as a child was, I'm here on earth trying my best to follow all the rules, and if I break one rule, God's waiting to condemn me. That He desired condemnation, judgment, not to show me mercy. And I think that explains a lot of the reasons why that people give up, because we have the wrong view of the character of God in our head. And I think that it's very, very important that we understand that God says one of His main character traits is a God who desires mercy. So I'm hoping, going back to the beginning of the sermon, that none of you said, the character trait I want to be known for is being a judgmental person. I'm hoping that none of you thought of I'm hoping that some of you thought that the character trait that I want to be known for is someone who is forgiving, someone who shows mercy, someone that is willing to help others rather than say, you're different than I am, therefore I don't want anything to do with you. That's my desire. So hopefully, as you were thinking about character traits, there's a character trait in there, positive one, of someone else that you could apply to your life. And I also think, hopefully, that we can all leave today hoping that we have determined that when it comes time for, oh, and by the way, in my classroom, if you're not willing to admit you're guilty, then how can mercy be shown? That is an important step that I left out. Guilty people can be shown mercy. Innocent people don't need mercy. So I know most of the time, like I said, when I'm accused of doing wrong, there's usually some truth in it. It might be a little truth, but there is some truth in it. And I want mercy. So I'm hoping that at this point, you have come to realize in your life that God is a God of mercy. If you are someone who has not been baptized, someone who needs to study more, someone that wants to get to know the God of mercy better, then there are people here that can help you do those things. And I would ask that you please come forward as we sing our song.